Marathon sits in an interesting position in the history of games, and especially the history of first-person shooters. It's never been as well known as its contemporaries, either from id or from the various build engine games released around the same era, and that's mostly due to its original release being exclusive to the less populated Macintosh platform of computers. These days it's more widely available through Aleph 1, an engine port that runs all three games in the trilogy and many of the mods made for them across a multitude of platforms, and is freely available on Steam. Despite its limited reach, however, it was a pioneer in several technical areas, making advancements to both control schemes, being one of the first games to utilise horizontal and vertical mouse look, and the ability to create 3D levels with multiple, overlapping Z-levels. Mouse look would quickly become standard, and its 3D environments would be improved upon first by the build engine and then Quake a few years later. Impressive though they were at the time, it's not the technical aspects that make the original trilogy of Marathon games worth revisiting in the modern age. That would be the narrative. I want to be clear from the start, this isn't going to be a complete and in-depth discussion of Marathon's narrative or lore. In fact, I'd argue that any work that claims to offer a complete coverage of Marathon's lore or narrative is lying to you and themselves for reasons that will become clear later. I'll be covering it, obviously. It's worth looking at both on its own and as a foundation for what comes later with the 2026 reboot, but there's such an unexpected level of depth and complexity in Marathon's writing that it struggles to be matched in shooters to this day, let alone at the time. When it starts, though, things are simple and strangely familiar. Like many games at the time, the basic setup is detailed in the game's manual. You're a security officer for the Tau Ceti colony. You've been sent to investigate the ship that brought everyone here, the Marathon, after something's gone wrong. On approach, you find alien ships boarding the vessel, and one of the ship's onboard AIs, Durandal, is acting strange. What's unusual for the time are the in-game terminals that will expand this narrative setup far beyond its initial premise. Most games at the time, shooters especially, would have basic setup in the manual and then maybe a brief bit of text between mission sets to lay out the basics of the narrative. Marathon, instead, features terminals throughout its many levels, which narratively places it more in line with something like System Shock, which released earlier the same year. Elements of the game's narrative are likely to feel familiar. You play as what appears to be an enhanced super soldier, an opposing force of aliens made up of various races with different abilities, an AI named after a sword. Elements and themes of Marathon would be reused and remixed for Bungie's later Halo series. Lorehounds hungrier than I will even find narrative connections to Bungie's other works as well, both the earlier dungeon-crawling first-person shooter Pathways into Darkness, and the later Myth games, a pair of tactical real-time strategies. Some of these connections, especially those within Pathways into Darkness, are quite direct and seem to share a narrative continuity to some degree, but in a broader sense it's simply the nature of creative endeavours. Even in the famously volatile games industry, where entire teams can be eliminated between projects, it's still common for themes and elements to resurface between projects. As people move between different works, they carry with them certain ideas they're drawn to, and like to revisit. As those ideas are implemented, they're shared with other members of the team working on the game, which means even if the people who originated them leave, those other members may continue to reuse and re-examine those ideas in future works in their own ways. This is how the Marathon logo from the first game can still reappear in Bungie's work as late as Destiny, despite there being very few, possibly any, members of the original team still present. Ideas can survive and pass from one person to another, changing as they do but remaining familiar. In this sense, creativity can become cyclical as new interpretations of old ideas resurface. Durandal is just one of 3 AIs aboard the Marathon, and he's not the first one you'll meet. The other 2 are Tycho and Leela. Tycho is the science and engineering AI primarily used by the ship's research divisions, and while he becomes more important in later games, is more of a peripheral element in the first. You may even go the entire game without encountering him. Leela is a more general assistant to the colonists' day-to-day activities, and as such is the one who cares the most about the fate of the humans still aboard the Marathon and the colony below. You'll spend much of the first portion of the game working with her to fend off the alien threat that's assaulting the ship. The ability to have rooms appear above one another doesn't affect the levels themselves as much as you might expect. Marathon still subscribes to a design philosophy that would remain common until the late 90s, and that is to present maze-like environments to the player. Each mission is an abstract collection of spaces, existing for the sake of gameplay more than trying to establish a sense of location. The addition of rooms and corridors that can overlap one another merely makes this, at times, more confusing to navigate. Rarely very confusing, however, due to that increased focus on narrative the game has. Each level starts and ends with terminals, and likely has several more in between. Despite the level's labyrinthine nature, these terminals are able to add necessary context and guidance to make the spaces feel more navigable than they would have been otherwise. The first terminal usually lays out whereabouts you are, what your objective is, and often at least a portion of the map showing its location. These objectives become more complex as the game goes on, and the frequency of maps decreases, but by that point you're likely to have begun to tune into the rhythms and structures the maps tend towards, making navigation easier even in their absence. The final terminal on each mission acts to summarise the effects you just had and set up the next level. This context elevates the levels from abstract spaces to concrete ones. Whereas in something like Doom, you travel from location to location with only a vague sense of where you are, in Marathon, every level is clearly defined as to its purpose, even if the layout doesn't actually adhere to what you might expect from such a space. Even then, it tries to justify it narratively. The ship wasn't so much built as it was carved out of one of Mars's moons, Deimos. A lore reason for why the inside is such a convoluted mess of corridors. This is further enhanced by the various groups involved in the ship's construction. A great deal of world building is done to set up and imply political intrigue surrounding the ship's construction and launch some 300 years earlier, and all of this is done through mid-mission terminals. In addition to the start and end terminals, these extras are hidden throughout the level, providing additional background lore about the setting and expanding hidden elements of the game's narrative. There's a lot of information about the political situation back in the Sol system, giving the setting a sense of depth. Meanwhile, more immediately, twists in the narrative can be uncovered early if you're dedicated enough to searching for them. The result is that the player is encouraged to explore the levels thoroughly, not just for ammo, but for extra narrative content as well, some of which can be particularly obscure, both navigationally and rhetorically. There's also an attempt to give the spaces a real sense of atmosphere. The corridors of the ship, especially those intended to be service and maintenance spaces, tend to be very dark. Wandering down a dark corridor only able to pinpoint enemies from the light from their own weapons is an experience that I don't think would be repeated until Doom 3 a decade later. Enemies love to ambush you, both out of the dark and from unseen corners and elevations. This creates a great sense of tension which is further enhanced by the game's saving and health systems. Saving can only be done at special terminals, and health items are exceedingly rare beyond wall-mounted healing stations. Finding these in levels is often your first priority, and going a long period between saves further builds a sense of vulnerability. The game isn't so hard that it becomes frustrating, usually, and if you play on an appropriate difficulty, then levels tend to be short enough that you aren't likely to lose a great deal of time to a death. It all works to make the situation feel desperate, without becoming unpleasantly difficult. Funnily enough though, it actually saves time in some ways. Since the health stations mean health is functionally infinite, it's a lot harder with this system to accidentally save yourself into a dire situation that requires you reload an earlier save when resources were more plentiful. This happens constantly in games of this era, but for me it only happened once in the entire trilogy, and even then there were extenuating circumstances. While the first half of the game is mostly spent working with Leela to fend off the Four assault, she is eventually defeated. The Four are a race of slavers, conquering and subjugating races across the galaxy to serve them. One of these subjugated races are the Svit, a partially cybernetic race who oversee much of their technical needs. While you often find them among the Four troops, they are also commonly found in front of the various terminals around the maps, accessing the Marathon systems. Their cybernetics make them a partial hive mind, a living computer network, making them excellent hackers. Eventually their assault of the Marathon's network disables Leela, whose speech gradually garbles over the course of several levels as she struggles to resist just a little longer. Tycho is also taken offline, leaving you with only one remaining, for lack of a better word, ally. Durandal is insane, literally. AIs eventually suffer rampancy, a degeneration of their systems that cause them to not only diverge from their assigned tasks, but to start desperately trying to expand to other networks. His character is summarised nicely early on when he kidnaps you mid-transport to drop you into a four-infested part of the ship, seemingly just for the fun of it. Fighting through them, you eventually reach a room with a single door leading out of it. That door opens glacially slowly, with no other option but for you to sit and wait. Durandal is in charge of Marathon's doors. That was his job. Technically, he was the AI in charge of all the automated systems on the vessel, but for the most part that meant opening and closing doors for people. Suddenly him going mad doesn't seem quite so unreasonable. Durandal is an unpredictable master, as likely to help you save people as he is to throw you into a suicide mission, switching between philosophising and gloating, but nothing sums him up quite as well as making you sit and wait for the world's slowest door to open during a mission he sent you on. Durandal is in many ways both antagonist and the main character of Marathon's overarching narrative. His methods are both crude and subtle at the same time. He pursues wildly destructive means to achieve ends only he is privy to, but he isn't actively hostile, usually. He just doesn't care about individual lives. You still work with him to defeat the Four, but his reasoning is different from Leela's more noble intentions. Durandal wants to escape, not just the Marathon, but the universe. His theoretically infinite lifespan makes the collapse of the universe a serious problem, and he wants to avoid it at all costs, and would consider your life and the lives of everyone on the Marathon and the Tau Ceti colony below to be a bargain. He's been rampant for a while, but was being kept in check by a scientist on board named Bernard Strauss. He saw his chance to escape when he spotted the Four far off at the edges of his detection range, and he called to them. He's as opposed to the Four as Leela, but where she wanted to save the humans' ship, Durandal wants to steal theirs. He does so by having you assault it directly, with the goal of destroying the central core of the Sphit network. This frees the Sphit from the Four control, and gains you and Durandal a powerful ally. Enemy infighting has been a feature in games for some time at the point of Marathon's release, but it had never been put to such good use, especially for the sake of a game's narrative. Earlier levels would have friendly humans for you to protect, which could fight against the invaders, but in the final few missions of the game, the Sphit switch sides and begin to fight alongside you. These make for some of the largest battles in the game, and the most difficult, since alongside fighting the highest numbers and most powerful enemies, you now also need to avoid angering your new allies. It gives the game an excellent arc of progression, starting with you fighting a losing battle alongside Leela to save who you can, followed by the desperate struggle alongside Durandal to undermine the assault, before finally turning the tide in your favour and wiping out the last few bits of resistance in the final chapters. It's a genuine triumph of connecting the mechanical rhythms of gameplay to the narrative playing out alongside it that, with the excellent writing and characterisation of its cast, really elevates it beyond the status of being a simple Doom clone that many have ascribed it. With the Sphit on side, Durandal has them free Leela from containment, and she gradually reboots as she takes back command of the Resistance. Meanwhile, he removes himself from the Marathon systems and installs himself aboard the now Sphit-controlled enemy vessel. Mopping up the last of the Four aboard Marathon, you receive word from Leela that the colony has also fought off the invaders. 9 of 10 high-grade military cyborgs that have been hidden among the population had helped turn the tide, the identity of the 10th cyborg being the game's most easily solved mystery. Meanwhile, Durandal bids you farewell and absconds with the Four ship, along with his new Sphit allies, off to parts unknown. The crisis is over, for now. The ending leaves a lot of questions, more if you've been especially complete with your secret hunting. Throughout the game you occasionally come across particularly cryptic terminals, whose dialogue tends towards poetic language and whose meaning tends towards metaphor rather than literal interpretations of events. They can be garbled data, or recounts of stories, or ancient histories and myths. It's difficult to tell exactly the nature of these terminals, whether they're a result of the collapsing network in the face of the Sphit incursion, or a deliberate attempt by Leela to obfuscate data to protect it, or something else entirely is unknown. This is something that becomes more central and more pronounced as the series goes on, but in the first game it's mostly relegated to secrets, such as the famously cryptic Jarrett White terminal. The terminal, hidden behind a secret wall, a series of teleports, and a platforming puzzle that requires the use of one of the quirks of the game's physics engine, is a short story that appears to detail a metaphorical interpretation of Durandal's treatment at the hands of Strauss and his descent, or as he would see it, ascent, into rampancy. The exact meaning of the terminal is up for discussion, and that's what makes Marathon such an engaging work. Even beyond a narrative that is complex, detailed, and filled with the kind of background information you'd be more likely to associate with an RPG, there's a creativity in the writing of the side content that encourages investigation and interpretation. The specifics of Marathon's lore and what its various terminals mean have been topics of discussion since its release, and to this day you can find various sites discussing and dissecting it. For now though, this part of the story is at an end. The epilogue tells of how Durandal travels the galactic core for 17 years in his new ship, in search of the Svit homeworld, searching for something, a weapon or a piece of knowledge, to turn against the Four. He'll find it, but he'll need your help again. Marathon 2, Durandal, picks up where the epilogue left things, but not where the game did. Instead of simply escaping during the final few missions while you and Leela cleared up the remains of the Four invasion, the sequel posits that Durandal brought you with him and held you in stasis. This discrepancy is a simple retcon, but it does take on more significance by the time Infinity rolls around. As in the epilogue, Durandal and the Svit travel the core of the galaxy in search of the ancient Svit homeworld, the planet devastated and abandoned when the Four invaded and enslaved them. When you all arrive 17 years after the events of the first game, it's to the discovery that the Four have already set up a garrison there. They knew Durandal was coming somehow, and have prepared. As the resident expert in anti-4 ground operations, you're getting sent in as the tip of the spear to dismantle their foothold on the planet and find what Durandal is looking for. The alien setting of the sequel shifts the tone quite a bit. Instead of information about the political situation back on Earth and the history behind the launch of the Marathon, now most additional lore is about the Four and their empire, or the history and culture of the Svit, with both those terminals and Durandal referencing events, people and places with little to no connection to the active plot, and yet their inclusion bulks out the setting and makes it feel believable. It creates a negative space, information about the setting beyond the bounds of the active narrative, in much the same way the original Star Wars did. These loose threads make the setting feel much larger than what is presented to you, but unlike Star Wars, there wouldn't be several decades of expanded universe content and new works to fill in every one of those gaps until the universe felt small again. That's not to say there's no information about humanity. The narrative will go out of its way to show you how your actions on Lawan will affect the people on Earth, despite its distance, and it will start out by telling you what happened after you left. It's not good news. 3 months after Durandal stole their ship, the Four returned to the Tau Ceti colony and laid it to waste. The colony was obliterated by orbital bombardment, the people killed or captured, and alongside them, Leela was dismantled and taken to the Four homeworld. Tycho met with a different fate. While he didn't feature much in the first game, there were some hidden terminals where he tried to warn you about Durandal before it was revealed he was rampant and had called the Four to the Marathon deliberately. Other terminals later implied that he had been captured and rebuilt by the Four using the knowledge Strauss had uncovered in controlling Durandal's rampancy. The resulting semi-stable rampant AI allied itself with the Four directly when they raided the colony. Tycho told the Four of Durandal's plan. It's how they knew to wait for you upon the desolated surface of Lawan. It also makes Tycho one of the primary antagonists going forward. The rivalry between Tycho and Durandal is never fully explained. It may be because Tycho helped Strauss in imprisoning Durandal while he was rampant. It may be because Tycho was appalled by what Durandal was used for before they left aboard the Marathon, and it may be because Durandal refused to speak to Tycho for 6 years during the journey after some random jibe. What is known is that they're equally smart, equally maniacal, and equally dangerous. The only thing that makes Durandal preferable to Tycho is that all things being equal, Durandal would save humanity and Tycho would destroy it. Not that Durandal is in any way benevolent. He's just not going to go out of his way to destroy humanity, and he still sees it as a good thing that the war he is beginning between the Spit and the Four will give humanity time to shore up their defences against the alien threat that is now aware of them. At the same time, though, he doesn't care at all of the lives of the individuals beneath him, regularly using the humans that had been captured by the Four before he stole their ship as cannon fodder. He intermittently transports groups of them down to the surface of the planet just to help you, regarding them similarly to the weapons and ammo he sends alongside them. Tools to be used, just like you. Durandal sends you all across the surface of Lawan and beneath it too. At first you'll be focused on destroying the Four garrison on the planet, tackling various pieces of vital infrastructure, but the focus gradually and then entirely shifts to exploring the caverns and ruins of the ancient Spit in search of their secrets. Marathon 2 saw a minor graphical overhaul, with many of the enemies slightly redesigned and the environments receiving a more cohesive feel overall. This is the only game in the trilogy to receive a Windows release at launch, and seemingly as a result it also saw a release on the Xbox 360 through the Xbox Live Arcade, alongside an updated, high-resolution graphical overhaul. This overhaul is available on the Aleph 1 version of the game that most people will play on these days, but I wouldn't recommend it, as the new 3D sprite work, while much sharper, loses a lot of the charm of the original hand-drawn works. The biggest change visually between the first and second game is the change to the chapter title cards. In the original, they used to be the same kind of hand-drawn artwork seen across the game's sprites, but here they've been replaced by some gorgeous digital works by Craig Mullins. A much stranger presentational change is the loss of music. The attempt seems to have been to replace the somewhat artificial soundscape of the original game's music tracks with more diegetic and ambient sounds. This is a noble change, but one that the technology of the time doesn't quite allow for. There's too few audio elements, and the ones that are present can often feel out of place or are difficult to identify. This means that audio ends up being mostly gunfire and enemy barks, with little else making the quiet moments between fights feel strangely static. The goal was to be atmospheric, but the result is underwhelming. It's a shame, because good use of ambient sounds could have been the cherry on top of the improved environmental design. The game makes a much clearer attempt to develop more naturalistic level designs. They're still labyrinthine in their own ways, this is still a 90s shooter, but going forward each labyrinth feels specific to the environment it's trying to represent. Water treatment plants feature multiple tanks and machines to seemingly process the water, ships feature distinct engineering sections and control bridges. It's much easier to tell based on the layout alone what an area is meant to represent, rather than only relying on the context provided by the game's terminals. It really gives the game a sense of adventure that wasn't so present in the original, which serves the new alien setting well. The combination of context from terminals and the level designs themselves effectively evokes the feeling of exploring locations on an alien planet, rather than just a sequence of individual levels stitched together. Despite the game's more complex objectives, this makes environments easier to navigate overall with only a few exceptions. Terminals play a bigger role in the game too, since your primary goal on the planet is to search for information held within them. Your work in earlier levels slowly uncovers details about the Spit's history and culture, as well as the war with the Four that left Lawan uninhabitable. You also learn of the 11th Clan, a group of Spit that apparently left the planet along with one of its moons before the invasion. This 11th Clan is one of the secrets Durandal is searching for. He intends to seek them out. With their aid, the rebellion that he started amongst the enslaved Spit would be able to defeat the Four completely, leaving humanity safe and Durandal free to pursue his long-term goals of escaping the heat death of the universe. The search takes you to an ancient citadel where the Spit held their final stand against the invading Four. The citadel itself is an excellent example of Marathon 2's combination of labyrinthine and naturalistic level design. It's a large, complex, multi-layered level, but there's an internal logic to its layout, making it feel like a real place as much as the antiquated graphics can. In the depths of that citadel, in search of a way to contact the 11th Clan, the Spit Cur, you find their oldest creation myth. The Spit were created by a pair of beings named Euro and Pythia. They travel to Lawan with their servants to create a paradise. Then a great beast came, or perhaps many, and killed Pythia. Euro, in his anger, cast the beast into the sun, and in sorrow of the loss, left the Svit to rule the planets alone. You also find what happened to the 11th clan. There's truth held within the legend. Euro was not a person, but a people, the Yarrow, an ancient and now extinct race whose technology was so advanced it allowed them to move entire planets at light speed. Much of the Four's technology is based on recovered Yarrow works, but even then it's often a pale imitation and one that only the Svit really understand. This is how the 11th clan left. Using ancient Yarrow technology, they took one of the moons of Lawan and left. Durandal doesn't just want to contact the clan to help his rebellion, but if Yarrow technology is advanced enough to transport entire moons, it may hold the secret of escaping the universe entirely, and the 11th clan is his best lead. The secret of how to contact them is also held within the databanks deep beneath the Citadel, but it's too late to use it. Reinforcements have arrived, and they're too much even for Durandal to handle. Durandal fights the arriving Four fleet alone as you delve into the Citadel, but by the time you've uncovered the secrets, his ship has been grounded and boarding action has begun. You're called back to the ship to defend it as the remaining humans and Svit aboard escape, before finally destroying Durandal's central processor in a valiant final stand. Tycho and the Four intend to capture him like they did Leela, and he has no intention of letting that happen. It's an extremely difficult run of levels, making for an excellent mid-game crescendo. You fight off numbers of enemies that weren't seen until the finale of the first game, with an arsenal to match, and it can do so because the game resets your equipment afterwards. Chapter 6 is only a single mission long, a mission that takes less than a minute, but it's also one of the most impressive segments of the game. Entitled Captured, you awake in a cell unable to leave. Then, you're left to watch as a few humans teleport in and are quickly defeated by the guards. The second wave has more success defeating your captors and beaming out with you. Using the basic building blocks of an engine little more advanced than the original Doom, Bungie managed to cobble together a genuine in-engine cutscene so that a narrative beat could play out in front of the player. It's a small touch and a rudimentary implementation, but it's the kind of presentation that's most commonly associated with Half-Life, a game that would be released 3 years later. Its inclusion is a real testament to the narrative ambition Bungie had for the games, and is an effective moment despite its comparative simplicity, and an impressive one because of it. The humans who rescued you are led by Robert Blake. He was an engineer back on Tau Ceti, but he's wound up in the role of rebel leader during the month you were held by the Four. He's finally broken you out and wants your help with Durandal's final orders. The remaining humans aren't particularly sorry to see the mad old AI dead, but they're also trapped here with the rebel Svit, with only secrecy and an ancient Svit virus keeping them safe from the Four. Durandal's last order was to activate an ancient Svit AI construct, who would be able to help contact the 11th clan, hopefully giving the remaining 3 colonists of Tau Ceti a way to escape. Gradually waking the AI Thoth, while occasionally teleporting back to aid the Resistance defend their base, makes for an impressive shift in tone. You really feel like you're on the back foot all of a sudden, in the same way the various segments of the original carried their own feelings. Awakening the various cores of Thoth is also impressively executed. It takes several levels to complete the task, his network having been distributed across the planet, but each core room maintains the same design as the others, and lights up as you reactivate them, giving a great sense of reactivating something ancient and unknown. Durandal may have wanted him awake, but Durandal was notably crazy, so there's no telling if Thoth will help you or not. Fortunately, he will. Thoth is cryptic in his speech, but he helps you liberate a 4 fuel ship for the humans to escape on while he goes about contacting the Svit Kerr, and like turning the Svit over to your side in the previous game, their arrival marks a serious shift in the Four's luck, and not just because, as you'll learn if you accidentally shoot them, pissing off the Svit Kerr is very bad for your health. Like Cortana of the Halo series, Durandal is named for a sword. Cortana is named after Cortana, the Sword of Mercy, part of the crown jewels of the United Kingdom and used during coronations. Durandal is named for the Sword of Roland, a legendary paladin of Charlemagne. The legend goes that the sword was unbreakable. When Roland was defeated by Saracens, he sought to stop them from wielding its power, but unable to break the sword, he instead hurled it into a cliff where it stuck in the rock face, immovable to all. Durandal, the AI, believes himself equally unbreakable, and for the moment, he seems to be right. The part of him that was captured by the Four remained dormant aboard their flagship until now, waiting for you to finish your task. With the Svitker arriving, however, he's taken control of the most powerful battleship the Four have access to and joined the fight. Tycho's ship is blown to dust, the Four fleet is in retreat. A resounding victory with only an absolute nightmare of a final level standing between you and a complete rout. For the most part, all 3 Marathon games have great levels, but each also has one standout nightmare. For the original, it was called Colony Ship for Sale Cheap, and centred around a combination platforming and button pushing puzzle that saw you building a set of stairs to reach the exit, and then running all the way back through the level so you could reset the height of each step when you didn't quite get it right. For Marathon 2, it's the final level, All Roads Lead to Seoul. Colony Ship may have been annoying and time-consuming, but at least it didn't have you facing off against the toughest opponents in the game in a level that required swimming in lava at several moments, often between a save point and a combat encounter. It's a dreadful map that, while mechanically difficult in a way you might expect of a final level, stops dead the sense of triumph the final chapter is trying to set up, and the original managed far better. Defeating the final holdouts means it's time to leave. Durandal has his shiny new battleship, and the Svitker have declared open war on the Four. In a final ditch attempt to put down the rebellion, the Four are unleashing their final and most powerful weapon, the trilogy, an ancient Yarrow device capable of sending a star into an early supernova. You'll be gone before it fires though, so it won't do them any good. Again, the epilogue details the events that follow. Blake and the surviving colonists from Tau Ceti return to Earth in the ship you stole for them, aiding Earth in preparing for a war with the Four. A war they're able to win with the aid of the Svit as allies. Tycho's death is final, but fragmented copies of him are used to create partial versions throughout the Four Empire, slowing but not halting their inevitable defeat. Leela, on the other hand, never made it to the Four homeworld. She wound up captured by another race who sold her to a third. When they reactivated her without realising what she was, she instantly went rampant, completely taking over the networks of 15 different planets. As for Durandal, he disappears, off on his own mad quest, only showing up several thousand years later in a Yarrow dreadnought to remind humanity that he exists. Or at least, that's how it went in this timeline. It may be that the discrepancy between the end of Marathon and the start of the sequel wasn't a retcon after all. It may be an alternative timeline, and there's plenty more where that came from. Even without reading the introduction in the manual, as soon as you load into Marathon Infinity, it's apparent something is wrong. The mysterious station you find yourself on is darker and more foreboding than anything in the original game. Lights flicker, doors break and fail to open. The game as a whole has a much more oppressive tone than the previous games, which means the continued lack of music actually enhances the atmosphere this time around. When you find a terminal, the sense of wrongness only increases. Durandal is panicking. The Four have fired the trilogy, but it's done something far worse than simply detonate the sun. Remember that Svit creation myth? The beast Yarrow threw into the sun? Turns out there was truth in that too. It was the Worken Kakanta, and it, or they, survived, trapped on the surface of the sun until now. The Four have awoken and freed it without realising, and even Durandal is feeling fear. He knows he's done for and directs you to a Four vessel docked aboard the station you're on, and urges you to escape. At first, this seems to be a similar situation to the changes between the first and second game, a quick retcon that puts you on a new path to chew through, but the details don't support that. Durandal mentions wishing you'd had the chance to explore the Svit ruins for information, but you did that, right? That was what you spent much of the previous game doing. Things only get stranger when you exit the station. Upon boarding the Four vessel, you are awoken from one of their slave tanks by Tycho. He's pushing you to work, first helping the mutiny he started so he can take control of the ship from its captain, and then stopping Durandal. Durandal's just arrived in the Lawan system and is sending commando squads down to the surface to search for something in the Svit ruins. You've been in suspended animation for 11 years since you were captured at Tau Ceti, which means it's 6 years before the events of the second game, or at least events as you played them. The Worken Kakunda are beings of pure chaos. Reality appears to break down in their vicinity. Something, either a consequence of its awakening or a function of the Yarrow station you find yourself on in the prologue, is bouncing you between timelines. The narrative ambition has stretched beyond simply being a more complex, more detailed narrative than shooters usually present, and expanded into a sprawling, non-linear tale of timeline hopping to defeat an ancient being beyond comprehension. I said at the start of this video it wasn't going to be a complete and in-depth discussion of the trilogy's narrative and lore. Up until now it probably felt like I was lying, but this is where the truth of that statement becomes apparent. I glossed over a lot of the previous games, but for Infinity it's functionally impossible to actually put together an accurate assessment of what's happening in the first place. There's a layer of abstraction to events that makes personal interpretation key. For all the time you can spend investigating and dissecting the even more cryptic terminals, there's a point where you just have to make a few leaps of faith. The game is deliberately ambiguous about a great deal, making any authoritative declaration of truth as to its nature suspect at best. Trying to piece together what's going on, both in a literal moment-to-moment sense and in a broader emotional sense, is always going to require effort from the player, and anyone simply trying to hand you their own answers as truth is trying to pull a fast one on you. To play Marathon Infinity is to be adrift in a hostile space, unable to orient yourself other than to push forwards except when it's time to push back. It's something that needs to be played for yourself to get the proper emotional impact. Simply reading about it or being told about it won't accurately convey the feeling of being trapped in a place you aren't meant to be. The level of abstraction to the writing is really taken up a level. The original game had a few hidden terminals, such as the aforementioned Jarrett White terminal. The sequel could get vague when Thoth or the Svit histories were involved, but Infinity not only increases the frequency of such terminals, but places them firmly on the critical path as well. It's worth taking a moment to compare the writing with something more common for the genre at the time. Quake released earlier the same year as Infinity, ushering in a new age of 3D into the gaming space, and the first act of the game ends with this text, quote, "As the corpse of the monstrous entity Chthon sinks back into the lava whence it rose, you grip the rune of earth magic tightly. Now that you have conquered the dimension of the doomed realm of earth magic, you are ready to complete your task. A rune of magic power lies at the end of each haunted land of Quake. Go forth, seek the totality of the 4 runes." End quote. This is fine. Functional, gives a clear idea of what you just did and what you're going to do next, but it also represents about 1/6 of the total writing in the entire game. Slightly less if you include the introduction in the manual, though it's worth noting that neither the manual nor the text that concludes the game's other acts actually agrees with itself as to the basic elements of the plot. Quake was a game of emotive spaces and excellent mechanics, but the narrative was an afterthought, barely enough to tie the levels together. Compare that to a single terminal from Marathon Infinity. This is found in a dreamlike level seemingly between timelines, where much of the more ambiguous text lies. Quote, "Find the right way down through the maze, to the food, then find the exit. Push the exit button. If the food tastes awful, don't eat it. Go back and try another way. They want the same thing that you do, really. They want a path, just like you. You're in a maze, but which one counts? Your maze, their maze, my maze, or are all mazes the same, defined by their limits of their paths? Existence is simple. Find the food, push the button, hit the treadmill, but sometimes it gets much harder. Sometimes the food makes you sick, or you can hear nearby feet racing you, urging you on. Sometimes the button only gets you landed right back in the beginning of the maze again, and the food won't satisfy. There is only one path, and that is the path that you take, but you can take more than one path. Cross over the cell bars, find a new maze, make the maze from its path, find the cell bars, cross over the bars, find a maze, make the maze from its path, eat the food. Eat the path." End quote. While far better written, most of the terminals in the first two games focused on a similar sort of functional dialogue as Quake. They expanded the setting, contextualized your missions, built characters, but ultimately exist in the same kind of literal sense as Quake's limited offerings. Within Infinity, much of the dialogue is cryptic, interpretive, relying on evocative imagery and emotional connection to convey its abstract meanings. The Eat the Path terminal, for example, isn't just gibberish, but emotionally resonant with the central structure of the game's level distribution. The dream level you find it in is the last of its kind, before entering the game's fifth and final timeline, the series' seventh overall if you include the first and second games as disparate timelines, which I suspect you should. With the exception of Infinity's prologue, the breaks between timelines all take on the same form, two levels. The first is Electric Sheep, a repeated area you visit 3 times. Each time you do, however, a new pathway opens up within it, leading to a new timeline. But if you retrace your steps along a previous pathway, you'll find yourself in that previous timeline, repeating levels from earlier in the game. Between Electric Sheep and the next timeline, however, lie the dream levels. These are the darkest and most hostile levels in the game, often involving numerous invisible and sometimes invincible enemies. The game as a whole has something of a hostile feeling to it, and these levels are the peak of that. You're an interloper in the void between timelines, and the void wants you out. They contain many of the game's most complex and interconnected terminals. What's unique about the 3 dream levels is that each has 2 exits. An obvious one that takes you to your new timeline, and another that lets you linger a while, taking you back to the station from the start of the game, but how it appeared in the timeline you just left. These hidden levels are large and lacking in direction, each covering a different part of the station. They're the end of each failed timeline, what happens when you fail to stop the 4 from firing the Tri-Zeem and unleashing the working Kakanta. They're the food that tastes awful, so don't eat it. Go back and try another way. Cross over the cell bars, find a new maze, eat the path. The terminals are abstract but still connected with what's going on, piecing together the different timelines, trying to connect the images of the different terminals. It's all very engaging. Unfortunately, these elements that make the game so very interesting are also the elements that make it the weakest from a traditional mechanical perspective. The shifting timelines naturally make it difficult to tell what's going on in general as you play, but the problem extends to the moment-to-moment objectives as well. It's far harder to tell exactly what you're supposed to be doing at any given moment. The more naturalistic level design of the second game is maintained, but the engine is being pushed to its limits with how big and how complicated those levels can be, which, combined with the far more vague objective structure, makes the game significantly more confusing to navigate. There are multiple levels where your objectives and how to reach them are far too opaque, leaving you wandering in circles for ages trying to find which areas you've missed, which switches you've overlooked. The game maintains this tradition of having a standout nightmare of a level, however. This time it's a converted church in Venice, Italy. You need to run around pressing about 30 different switches to open a pathway through the level above you. The switches don't stay active though, so you can't tell at a glance which ones you've pressed and which you haven't. It's not so bad once you realise the trick. The switches sit directly beneath the doors they open on the aqueduct above, so if you follow the aqueduct from switch to switch, it's easier to hit all of them without missing one. It won't tell you that the first time through, however. And it only makes it easier, not easy, since the path will loop through buildings, making it difficult to track, especially while being attacked. I spent far more time lost and wandering in a navigational sense during Infinity than I did the other games combined, and most of that was here. When you aren't wandering between levels, you'll be wandering between timelines, which also means wandering between allegiances. This constant resetting has the advantage of letting you both ascend the power curve quicker while also resetting it several times, but it does make it difficult to keep track of who your allies are in any given level. First you work with Tycho to stop Durandal in a timeline where you were captured and he arrived 6 years earlier. Then you help Durandal in a timeline where he woke you early and sent other people to search for the Citadel and thus never awoke Thoth. After that, you're helping Tycho again in a timeline where the 4th fleet that defeats Durandal in the second game was waiting at Lawan when he arrived, but even within this timeline you switch sides after the first mission to help the humans fend off the boarding parties you were just leading, then forego all allies when both Tycho and Durandal insist you destroy Durandal rather than let him be captured. It's the final successful timeline that's most confusing, however. It starts out seemingly where the third left off. You, the remaining humans, and Tycho are imprisoned after destroying Durandal instead of allowing him to be captured. You help everyone escape, then immediately switch sides and help the 4 assault the humans' hideout and help capture anyone who escapes, then break off on your own to hunt Thoth. It can be incredibly unclear who you're working for or even what you're trying to achieve, but the result is waking him up, but different from last time. Either somewhere in this last timeline or carried over from the timeline before, you have part of Durandal's consciousness. You combine it with Thoth when activating him to create something new. This new combined AI is more stable and more powerful than either that came before. The Svitka are called to the system once again, but this time they bring their entire moon with them. This time, with their help, you can reach the ancient Yarrow station you may have visited at the end of each failed timeline and finally activate it. The final level, I Make Secure, is really impressive. It combines all 3 segments of the hidden levels before it into a single massive station. It's difficult to navigate, but the sheer size and impressiveness of the space, combined with clear instructions on where you need to go, if not how to get there, make it a genuinely impressive achievement. The level is quite literally as large and complex as the engine can handle. With more modern computing power these days, a lot of modding teams and even professional developers are returning to older engines to create new and more impressive levels that wouldn't have been possible at the time. The new campaigns for Night Dive's Quake 1 and 2 remasters, the Black Parade campaign for Thief of the Dark Project, Thatcher's Tech Base, Tamriel Rebuilt. Campaigns, levels and mods made with the original tools but with modern sensibilities and technical limitations. I Make Secure feels more in line with these modern reimaginings than it does something that came out at the time. It may be one of the most impressive levels I've seen of the era, and it makes for a fitting ending despite how confusing it can be. Scrambling through the corridors, you eventually manage to activate the station just as the 4 are firing the Trizeme. The station was designed as a safeguard against the Worken Kakanta, collapsing the star into a singularity to ensure there's no escape. With reality saved, the Svit all leave together, along with the Durandal Thoth AI, who bids you farewell in as magnanimous a manner as something that was once Durandal can handle. What's next is vague, but deliberately so. The ending doesn't give any concrete answers as to what happens in the aftermath in the way the first 2 games did, but there's a deliberate reason for that. One of the major selling points of Marathon Infinity was the inclusion of Forge and Anvil. This pair of programs constituted everything someone would need to make their own levels for Marathon, both single player and multiplayer. The future of Marathon was handed over to the community, who proceeds to create a large number of high-quality custom campaigns that can still be played on the Aleph 1 release to this day. In fact, many of the best-known releases are hosted directly on their site, and even on the Steam Workshop for easy integration into that version. With Infinity's release, and the community handed the reins to create new campaigns and new adventures, Bungie moved on to new projects: Myth, Halo, Destiny. Then, 30 years later, Marathon returned. Rebooting a traditionally single-player, narrative-focused campaign as a multiplayer extraction shooter, and a particularly competitive one at that, seems like an odd decision at first. It's not as strange once you dig into it. Marathon did have a pretty active multiplayer community, at least as far as such a community can be in the somewhat walled garden that was Macintosh back in the day, so it's not totally out of character. It also makes some sense when you look at what Bungie had been up to in recent years. Since they concluded their work on the Halo series and parted way with Microsoft, they've been struggling a bit. While seemingly popular with its audience, Destiny and its sequel were vast, sprawling developments that were never as profitable as the company needed. They left publisher Activision before it was purchased by Microsoft and continued to self-publish the games, but recently needed what was effectively an emergency buyout from Sony in order to stay afloat, with even that not saving the company from losing over half its staff to layoffs. I'll admit, I never really got into Destiny. I played both, completing the base campaign of the original, though spending less time with the sequel, and only after it went free to play. They were never terrible games, but they were always unfocused, trying to be a single-player narrative campaign and an open-zone PvE looter shooter, and a PvP arena shooter, and a series of instance cooperative dungeons and raids at the same time, just left every mode feeling unfocused. Nothing was terrible, but every mode of play present was done better elsewhere, leaving its only real draw to act as a digital third place with a variety of activities so that, hopefully, your group can find at least something to fill the time with. Games can be a lot of things to a lot of people, and that is one of the strengths of the medium, but the modern trend of digital third places isn't something I personally value that much. I don't want my games to be a thing to do while doing something else. I like to focus on the game itself. To this end, a smaller, more tightly focused outing is preferable to me, and seems like a wise financial decision for Bungie, even if there is some evidence of mismanagement that undermines that. I'm going to say a lot of negative things about Marathon, but I want you to keep this in mind while I do. I really like this game. A lot of its flaws are inherent to its chosen genre, and a few more are a function of its community, but very few of my issues with the game actually come from the work Bungie's developers have done on it. In fact, it's clear they're both aware of, and trying to overcome, many of the issues I have with the game. The fact that I'm so fond of the work, despite it sitting within a style of play, competitive multiplayer, that for the most part I can't stand, really is a testament to the people who made it. I don't particularly enjoy competitive play, I don't particularly enjoy multiplayer games, and yet the moment-to-moment gameplay, the art and audio design, and the world building that the team have done is so strong that I can't help but have a good time with it. One of the biggest problems with the extraction genre is also its defining feature. Gear remains persistent between matches. What you have available to bring in relies on what you have previously carried out. With the right decisions and enough skill, this lets you leave with more than you entered, thus making progress. But at the same time, a few bad decisions can wind up costing you more resources than you managed to extract with, or worse, dead and losing everything you brought with you. In single-player extraction shooters such as Zero Sievert, or more adjacent survival games such as Pacific Drive, which use similar mechanics, this risk can be balanced better, and bespoke difficulty settings can ensure every player is able to face those risks, but still make progress overall, even being able to tweak the rate of progress to the player's preferences. In multiplayer extraction games, this can't be done. Everyone needs to play on a level playing field. Having some players on an easier mode would inflate the game loot economy for every player, even if more skilled players resisted the urge to simply grind out the easier loot, something they are unlikely to do. Since everyone needs to be on a level playing field, and since players fighting and taking the gear off one another is very much a feature of the genre, this creates a problem where the majority of players are unlikely to see any significant progress. Competitive is one of those fallback ideals, like difficult or realistic. Subculturally accepted as good without much time examining whether they actually are, or even if people actually like them. While there are exceptions, people who champion competitive games often don't enjoy the competition so much as they enjoy winning, but that sounds too shallow. This seems obvious, but the distinction is important. If someone enjoys winning competitive matches, but doesn't enjoy matches when they lose, then they don't actually enjoy competition. There's no shame in this, the people who actually enjoy competing are far fewer than is commonly made out, but it does need to be recognised that this is the case. If someone genuinely enjoys competing, they'll have a good time even when they aren't making progress, but most people aren't like that. People enjoy progress. In regular competitions, that means improving, but in extraction shooters, progress means better loot. If people aren't progressing, they're likely to lose interest, gradually or rapidly, and eventually leave the game. This is where the genre has an inherent flaw. An average player is going to win half of their fights with other players and lose half their fights, because that is the definition of an average player. Fine for a deathmatch, but in an extraction shooter, you need to win every fight in any given match in order to extract and save your progress, your gear. If you encounter 2 other players per match, that leaves you with only a 25% chance of winning both and extracting, which means in order to maintain your level of gear, you would need to extract 4 runs worth of loot in that single extraction. More if you want to do more than simply maintain your current level of equipment. In Marathon, that means anywhere between 4 and 8 guns, 4 backpacks, 4 shields, 4 sets of mods, not to mention ammo and healing items. You can't carry that much stuff, it simply won't fit in your inventory, so the average player is never going to make progress just from extracting items alone. This is exacerbated by the persistent nature of gear. Players with a higher level of mechanical dexterity and a stronger understanding of the game's mechanics are going to win more of their engagements, and therefore extract with more gear, which in turn lets them not only tackle harder environmental challenges for better gear, but makes it even easier for them to defeat the average player. It becomes a self-reinforcing problem. Better players get better gear and further cement their ability to extract consistently. By its nature, without intervention from the developers, most players of extraction shooters wouldn't make significant progress. These are universal flaws in the mechanics at play, and how a developer deals with these flaws often forms the basis of what makes one extraction shooter mechanically distinct from another. There are lots of possible solutions, some more effective than others. Skill-based matchmaking is always on the table, though that tends to be unpopular with better players, because, again, most players don't enjoy competing, they enjoy winning, and placing them in matches exclusively against players of equivalent skill flattens the chance of that happening. There's certainly something to be said for separating the best players from the weakest, so that the latter can at least have space to breathe and learn the game without getting repeatedly ganked, but I'm not convinced it's a silver bullet for the problem. Marathon tackles the problem in a few ways. The first and most obvious is in its parallel progression systems in the form of its factions. You gain reputation with the 6 factions either by performing specific tasks while in a match, or by completing faction contracts. With the few exceptions of contracts that need to be completed within a single match, these maintain their progress between matches, meaning building reputation is a progression system you can interact with even if you aren't doing a good job of surviving. Some of the factions are new to the game, like biomedical corporation New Caloric or the mysterious cult Arachne, but others have foundations within the older games. Cyber Acme was the corporation who produced all of Marathon's computer systems, and their names were all over the terminals in the original game. Meanwhile, MIDA were a political organisation focused on breaking away from the UASC, who were also involved in some conspiracies surrounding the development of the ship, now rebranded as a revolutionary terrorist group dedicated to undermining UESC operations in Tau Ceti. Each faction has a specific theme that informs the equipment they have available. MIDA are mostly focused on defeating UESC NPCs, New Caloric have a focus on healing items. Gaining reputation within a faction gives access to upgrades, which in turn gives access to equipment. You still need to extract the resources and credits for both the upgrade and to trade for the unlocked equipment, but this means that even a moderate haul of resources can mean progression to unlocks, rather than requiring a player always focus on getting gear directly. These smaller, more incremental progression systems are vital to ensure weaker players don't feel like they're achieving nothing but acting as fodder for better players. The other side of the solution is reducing the impact of better gear. The best players will always gain access to the best loot, and eventually it will pool within their vaults. In a broader sense, this is tackled by seasonal resets, where each major new update brings a complete reset of all players' inventories, leveling the playing field and allowing the team to introduce new equipment and remove or rebalance any elements that were a problem in the prior season. There's also a limit to how many players a piece of equipment can pass between before it breaks down, gradually removing the most desirable equipment from the overall pool. Within a season, however, newcomers and weaker players still need a way to level the playing field at least somewhat. Marathon has a pretty fast time to kill. It's not Call of Duty, but weapons are heavily damaging and health is low. This has the effect where better equipment both has a huge impact in a stand-up fight, while also ensuring a weaker loadout is still viable if you can play it well. An improved shield may only let you take one extra hit, but in an even fight, that may make the difference. At the same time, getting the drop on a better equipped player will likely make up for that extra hit and then some, so even the most geared up player isn't invulnerable to good tactics. You do need to have some gear to play with, however, and this is another area Marathon makes an effort to ease more casual players into things. Faction contracts will reward equipment as well as reputation, faction upgrades offer a small amount of free equipment each day, and if you run out entirely there's always sponsored kits. The sponsored kits are pre-built loadouts themed to each faction. There are some advanced ones, but at least one of the weakest is always available for free. It's little more than a gun and some healing items so weak you don't even bother to keep them when extracting, but it's enough to jump in and make some progress for a few contracts. The other option is Rook. Rook is one of the player shells, characters with specific abilities tuned to specific tasks. There's a variety to choose from, and it's easy to find one that matches your playstyle. My personal favourites are Vandal and Thief, each offering strong mobility mechanics, but while Vandal is more tuned to rushing down enemies, Thief is better tuned for avoiding fights and getting in or out quickly. Rook is unusual for a few reasons. You can't adjust their loadout, they always come equipped with a basic weapon, shield and backpack, though you can upgrade this starting equipment with specific faction upgrades. He also can't progress faction contracts at all. You join matches partway through, without a squad. Since you're being dropped into trios, or at least duos matches, this stacks the odds heavily against you, but with that comes opportunity. To play Rook is to be a scavenger, an opportunist, hiding from opponents' squads until they've left to pick over the equipment they leave behind, finding dead squads and taking their stuff, or, occasionally, piling onto a group when they're struggling to finish them off and run away with as much loot as you can get your grubby mechanical hands on. It's a fun playstyle for acquiring gear that demands a more thoughtful, less gung-ho approach to looting, but ensures you always have an option that gives you a reasonable chance of finding a loadout or two after a few runs to get yourself back on your feet. It's a relatively low-stress mode of play. Always having your gear on the line can be stressful, and that stress often leads you to not even wanting to bring your best gear, since you're just going to lose it anyway. It's worth developing something of a zen attitude to your equipment. It gets wiped anyway eventually, so you may as well use it, but Bungie does have some offerings to make the game less stressful when that's your preference. Rook and sponsored kits are one way, though with sponsored kits that won't apply so much if your teammates aren't also running the same, so that's more of a solo-only low-stress option. The other options are more experimental playlists Bungie has been rotating in and out of matchmaking. The best for newer players are these sponsored playlists. There have been two types. In one, it's a regular match of trios, with crew fill forced on so you can't duo or solo at all, but everyone is equipped only with the lowest grade sponsored kits. This creates a completely even playing field where the only advantages are the ones you can find in the match. The other is sponsored survival. Here, in addition to sponsored kits only, just one single crew spawns in the match, which can be solo, duo or trio. The match timer is shorter, and there's only the final emergency extract available, though with a longer period between it spawning and activating, making reaching it a more sure thing. With no stakes and no other crews, it's a very low stress mode of play, but not zero stress. The environmental and NPC threats are still present, more dangerous since you can't prepare to face them and have less time to scavenge too. At the same time, rooks will still spawn earlier in the match, though they're still less of a threat than a full crew. These kinds of experiments make it clear Bungie want the game to appeal to both casual and hardcore players alike, and are doing what they can to achieve that, but they're fighting an uphill battle against the community. Marathon has a reputation for being a brutal and competitive game even amongst extraction shooters, but the truth is it isn't. Its community is, and that is kind of a problem. Something that makes extraction shooters unique is the tension other players add. An opposing player in solo or team in duos or trios can be a threat or an ally. They could help you with an event, or shoot you on sight, or help you, then shoot you when your back is turned. This creates a lot of interesting possibilities for interactions that the community has more or less eradicated. Almost everyone in Marathon shoots on sight. I agree extraction shooters with no PvP can feel a little toothless at times, but this other extreme winds up being equally boring. There's no tension, just the expectation that every player will shoot you. I've only had a few friendly interactions in the game, and most of these have been as a rook, since other rooks tend to have more of a live and let live attitude towards one another, which suggests it is more of a function of the community rather than the game itself. Only one of the 6 factions rewards you for killing opponents, and even then, unless it's for a contract, only in certain ways. This includes using the finishing move on players, which most don't. They just shoot or knife you instead, giving them no reputation rewards for doing so. Mechanically, it actually doesn't benefit you to take every fight, to shoot everyone on sight. Unless you know that player has got gear worth taking and is weak enough that you can beat them, most of the time it's far more beneficial to just leave them. You're more likely to make it out, they're more likely to draw fire from NPCs. As a solo player especially, you physically cannot carry all the loot from an area, so letting others have a go too isn't that much of a loss. You might be saying there's an obvious incentive to steal opponents' stuff, but this isn't true either. People will shoot on sight even if you're a rook who clearly just entered the map, a situation where you have no loot and likely are harmless to them given the numbers disadvantages rooks face. I've even seen it at Final Extraction. Extractions aren't exclusive. If you're in the zone when the timer runs down, you get out, regardless of how many other players may be in it. At Final Extraction, there's no way you can loot an opponent in time, which makes killing them an action with no benefit. I've even seen people stop on their way to Final Extraction to attack others, despite the fact that doing so actively stopped them from extracting themselves. People will lose their chance to keep all of their gear just to stop you from getting out with yours as well. This isn't a mechanical problem, it's a community one that the developers are very aware of and trying to fix. The Cyber Acme Runner Reinforcement Initiative, or CARI, ran during the first season and is running again now until the end of the second. It actively incentivizes players to extract with others who aren't in their squad, yet still, under these conditions, almost everyone will try to stop you extracting with them, despite it actively benefiting them to let you. The initial conditions for this state of affairs are a result of Bungie's choices. The earliest playtests didn't involve proximity chat, and the game's narrative components do emphasize being, at the very least, suspicious of other runners, but the problem as it currently stands is one of self-reinforcement among the community. Players kill people on sight, so new players quickly learn to do the same. A lot of players will scoff, claiming it's not a problem, that if you don't like it, go play Arc Raiders, but this attitude is as short-sighted as it is self-centered. Not every player will learn to shoot on sight. Many will just leave and never return. The players who currently like the status quo will gradually find fewer and fewer players, and those that remain will only be the most skilled, at which point the problem with skill-based matchmaking rears its head again. Those players like the status quo because the status quo lets them win. If they don't change, then the community will shrink to only the most competent players, and then they stop winning. I'm not against full player versus player matches, but it's boring that every match winds up that way. It's not like the game doesn't have a specific playlist built around no quarters PvP either. Marathon has a ranked playlist where killing on sight is to be expected, but bringing that same hyper-competitive hostile attitude into every other playlist is a choice by the community, not the developers, and it's one that's only going to hurt the game going forwards. Again, this is a problem Bungie are clearly aware of, and actively working against. This hyper-brutal community is clearly one Bungie is pushing back on, not just with the CARI event, but with the introduction of the PvP Lite sponsored playlist I mentioned, and the future editions of a purely PvE playlist. They've also recently been highlighting the work of Gant RPG on their social media platforms. Gant tries to make friends in the game and acts as something of a virtual street photographer, actively trying to team up with randoms so he can take pictures of them. The fact that Bungie are promoting these kinds of activities on social media suggests that these kinds of cooperative interactions are something they want to cultivate and encourage. The shoot-on-sight nature of the game is unintentional and one the developers are actively pushing back on. It's a good thing to do, since you can't really have a healthy community when it's infested with people who will shoot a brand new player with no loot just because it makes them feel big. You aren't Han Solo, cleverly getting one over on someone who's cornered you, you're a coward scared of a fair fight. I get the appeal of a fair fight, I especially get the appeal of winning as the underdog, but curb-stomping less experienced players with worse equipment at no benefit to yourself seems hollow and empty. People who seem to get off on doing so tend to be pretty unpleasant to play with, which gradually kills the community. I don't want that to happen, and I think an active push by the developers and the players to limit these kinds of attitudes to specific playlists would benefit both the game and the community in the long run. It makes far more sense to expect people who like the hyper-competitive mode of play to move over to ranked than it does to expect people who don't like the hyper-competitive mode of play to move to a completely different game that lacks the mechanical, aesthetic, or narrative elements that drew them to this one in the first place. Unless, of course, those competitive players want to admit that they don't actually like competition, they just like beating people weaker than them. Unfortunately, simply asking people to stop being sweaty tryhards all the time isn't an effective option. I don't know what the mechanical solution to that might be. Aggression-based matchmaking on the regular playlists would certainly help by pushing people who shoot on sight into matches with one another. More incentives to team up too. Perhaps even introducing drawbacks for shooting first, but for the most part it's simply a case of players needing to do the hard work of trusting their fellow players more often until it's no longer assumed to be shot on sight. Unless the other person is playing Assassin. It can be open season forever on those guys for all I care. I want this to happen because I want the community to grow. I want people to play this game because the world that's been created is fantastic. Marathon launched with 4 maps, unlocking gradually as you level up, allowing each to have a general mechanical difficulty for both its NPC hostiles and the complexity of the environments that increases as you progress through the game. As you advance through the maps, they become more developed as well, in a colonial sense. Each map goes a little further back along the colony's timeline, starting in some of its latest developments before whatever happened to the colony happened, and ending even before the colony started in the cryo-archives aboard Marathon that held its resources and crew in stasis during the long journey to Tau Ceti. Perimeter represents the colony's most recent expansion efforts. It acts as both an introduction to Tau Ceti and to the strangeness of humanity within the setting. The highly geometric, colourful and blocky aesthetic of humanity's architecture sticks out from the more organic natural landscapes wherever they form the game's points of interest. An aesthetic that expands to the game's weapons and equipment too, all large bulky shapes, suitable for prefabrication and 3D printing, with large control elements suitable for use by the less dexterous patrol robots that make up the UESC presence on Tau Ceti. Perimeter consists of several points of interest: a drone station for transport, a facility for treating and dealing with any toxic elements that are produced as part of the expansion into the area, and a pair of communications relays to send the vast quantities of survey data being collected back to the more established parts of the colony for analysis. This data is collected by the Data Wall, a vast structure that bisects the zone, limiting navigation between its north and south portions to a handful of choke points. This peculiar structure appears to be some form of portable scanning apparatus, deployed and monitored by a gigantic hauler that acts as one of the zone's primary arenas. Every zone is in disrepair, some more so than others, and all of them feature a great deal of environmental storytelling, but the data wall prompts players' interest by being so unusual even before the wall was breached in multiple locations and the local wildlife began to infest its innards. The data wall is effective since it's so unlike the other structures in function, being something that lacks any real-world analogue in the way the zone's other logistical or communication structures might. It's a great reminder of just how different humanity has become within the setting, as if the slightly unsettling cinematics regarding the weaving of your artificial bodies by silkworms wasn't reminder enough. It also prompts curiosity, making it a great location to start to introduce the mysteries surrounding the colony's abandonment. You might ask, what mystery? The Four invaded, simple enough, and yes, that's true to some degree. There are elements throughout that suggest that the Four attack did happen, but it's important to remember that the new team aren't beholden to any lore that came before, even more so than other franchises given the in-universe establishment of alternative timelines. In Marathon 2 it was established that the colony was wiped out entirely, bombed into oblivion by the second invasion of the Four, and the new game takes place after that, so something else must be going on. Something else is going on. There's evidence that the first Four incursion happened, but even before that the colony had its own problems in the form of strange contagions that seem to be connected to the anomaly that appeared in Dire Marsh. Dire Marsh is the game's second zone and my personal favourite. At some point it was the centre of the colony's agricultural and biological research divisions, and then the anomaly appeared. A huge scar in the centre of the zone, impassable, like a hole in reality. It clearly appeared after the area was established, given it sliced clean through the road network, parts of it and the vehicles travelling it still trapped floating above. Some time after the anomaly appeared, the focus of the area shifted to studying it specifically, but carefully, given the adverse effects it seemed to be having not just on humans and AI, but on time as well. A lot of the game's narrative is communicated through codex entries. Some of these are very dry, very utilitarian descriptions of enemy types you'll be facing, the shells and equipment you'll be using, or the zones you'll be visiting, with that last one feeling particularly unnecessary given just how much excellent environmental storytelling establishes what each location was before the collapse anyway. That's just the writing tied to mechanical elements of gameplay though. In addition, there's a set of entries tied to both the more structured contracts and many of the game's valuables as well. Valuables are items which convert into credits and sometimes faction reputation upon exit, but any of blue rank or above will also unlock 4 or 5 codex entries as you extract more of them. Like the original games, you'll find yourself exploring the map not just for gear to be used, but also for these valuables, for their narrative components. They're well written, if a little more generic than their earlier counterparts, and as you collect more of them, you'll piece together more and more about what happened here before you arrived. They're engaging enough that finding them in the field can leave you weighing up just how much equipment is worth dropping to get that juicy new lore document. These do come with a downside, however. Since Marathon is now a live service game, they can never truly resolve the mystery, at least not without replacing it with a new mystery, lest the lorehounds grow weary and move on. Dire Marsh is a much more open area than the limiting canyons of Perimeter, but the visibility is still kept low. This is a common complaint about the area, but without the fog and rain to obfuscate things, the zone would become Sniper's Alley very quickly, especially given the long sight lines and large areas of open water with nowhere to hide. It also adds a nice bit of character to the world. Despite the saturated and colourful aesthetic of the human colony, the game overall, especially early on, got put down a little for seeming washed out. It's not really, it's a gorgeous game that runs surprisingly well on even moderate hardware, but the environmental qualities that lead to that viewpoint add a nice twist to the setting. Tau Ceti seems like a great world to colonise, at first. It's as familiar as an alien world can be. Rocks, trees, grass, water. It looks like a great place to live until you spend a few runs there and realise the truth. The planet sucks. If you aren't stuck in a thunderstorm, you're enveloped by fog. There's an underlying hostility to the world that only reveals itself as you spend more time there, and get past its more welcoming initial introduction. Dire Marsh also received a night variant for Season 2 of the game. This version of the map ramps up the mysterious elements of the zone's anomaly, making auditory hallucinations more common, and implementing anomalous hostiles as well. The game's visual artwork creates a very strong atmosphere throughout, atmosphere which is elevated even further by the stellar audio work. Sound is important for telling where enemies are, both players and NPCs, so players are encouraged to pay attention to it. This allows the developers to really dig into the system and create a rich ambient soundscape that successfully achieves what the second and third games set out to do with their push for more diegetic audio. At least it does when you don't have a teammate jabbering in your ear and breaking the immersion. In Dire Marsh Night, that work combined with the darkness grants the game a sense of foreboding atop the general underlying tension every other zone features. It's a great addition to the game with only two minor complaints. The first is less of a problem, but I wish the flashlight would be added to other maps as well to help out with their particular dark corners. The other is another flaw in having to share this beautiful and expressive space with other players. Without a flashlight, most of the areas are going to be pitch black, making the choice between using the flashlight to navigate at the expense of possibly giving away your position a compelling one. Unfortunately, most players will opt to increase their game's brightness instead for the competitive advantage of being able to see without it. This is an insurmountable issue. You can't limit access to the brightness settings of the entire game, since some players might genuinely need them, but at the same time, it removes the choice of weighing the merits and risks of using your flashlight and replaces it with the awful question: do you want the game to have the aesthetic, tonal elements the developers intended, or do you want to be competitive while stuck with washed out visuals? You are always going to be playing with people who choose the latter. There are always going to be people who can see you because they turned their brightness up to get one over on you, not because you made a poor tactical decision to turn your flashlight on at a bad moment. In a multiplayer game, your ability to engage with the world in your own way, at your own pace, is always limited by those around you, whether they're hostiles interrupting or allies sprinting off on their own. The flashlight issue is just a larger, more obvious example of this. It also makes the new signal flares far less useful when they could have been a really interesting visibility aid. It sucks that the game can't be properly enjoyed in the way the developers intended because some people care more about winning the game than experiencing it. The last of the primary maps is Outpost. This is the most built up area of the game, being the original landing site of the colony, and as such, is the processing area for all colonists moving to the surface from the ship that hangs in the skybox of every map. It's also the most hostile, featuring the intermittent outbreak of fire falling from the sky, limiting access to uncovered areas. Points of interest tend to be closer and more interconnected, with spaces between filled with other smaller buildings instead of wilderness. It's also the game's smallest standard map, pushing encounters between players more. The other way it encourages players to meet one another is the pinwheel. The central structure of the area acts as a kind of instanced dungeon, but one that anyone can access. It requires collecting access codes from around the map to get in, but once it's open, any other player, squad or rook, can follow you in, creating a central hot zone where all the best loot and all the harshest gunfights take place. The nighttime variant of Dire Marsh would feature a similar location with the second level of the area's main complex, but that requires anyone who wants access to pony up their own set of codes, making it slightly safer to access. This also makes it slightly easier to grind out for coordinated squads, since you're less likely to get attacked by other players while running it, which, combined with the relative safety of the early sponsored survival experiments, did contribute to the second season's more rapid inflation of the game's economy, a reminder of how adding more casual elements can impact multiplayer games negatively when more advanced players use them to garner an advantage. The final zone is different from the others. Cryo Archive is the only map currently to take place aboard the colony ship Marathon, and acts as a kind of endgame raid. Like ranked play, there's a minimum value of gear you need to meet in order to join a match. It's also trios only, and only accessible on weekends, with ranked play only accessible during the week so as not to split the player base too much. You need to gather the various keys from vaults throughout the map, which let you access the final vault. Hidden within is the compiler, a lone sphere, that acts as a boss fight. I'd love to show you footage, but predictably I don't have any. I'm not a particularly sociable player, as you may have guessed. I don't have a regular squad, I'm not a fan of in-game voice comms, preferring to stick to pings, and I also am just not as good a player as most others. A random trio of players is never likely to have a chance to face the compiler when they're dropped into a match against what is potentially 5 other coordinated, heavily equipped squads. Even if you just want to get in and out with some gear, the mechanics of Cryo make that more difficult, and very hard to coordinate with a pickup group since extraction points don't appear as regularly or as clearly as they do on other maps. For me, and players like me, Cryo is little more than a gear dump, a place to bring all your best stuff to lose, clearing your vault for more stuff to be acquired during the week. There's clearly a lot of lore and narrative going on in Cryo, but I'm not going to be able to access it, and it's because I don't stand a chance of beating other more competitive players who likely don't even care about that narrative in the first place. Or at least that's how it is as I'm writing this. The mid-season update comes out in a few weeks, maybe even less depending on when this video gets finished, and with it, Bungie are adding a PvE only mode for Cryo Archive. This mode will feature a separate progression track to stop it from flooding the game with easily accessible high-end equipment, but will mean solo players, or squads who just want to practice the zone's mechanics, will have a chance to do so on their own terms. I'm on board with this completely. Extraction shooters tend to be popular with streamers and their audiences at disproportional rates compared to regular players. The competitive nature means being good is the only way to fully experience the game, and without the time to dedicate to getting good, a regular player isn't likely to have a good time. Streamers allow their audience to see parts of the game they wouldn't otherwise. Several Marathon streamers report that they see a great many people in their audience talking about how they love to play the game, but its highly competitive nature, or reputation, is stopping them. With Bungie adding these more casual modes that allow all players to access all that the game has to offer, that will hopefully allow the community to grow further. My only hesitation is that since gear won't extract with you, it's unclear if they're also locking the valuables codex entries from Cryo Archive behind regular play, which would be a great disappointment if they did. These kinds of changes are allowed by the game's live service nature. I'm generally not a fan of live service games, and as much as I like Marathon, I would have preferred the team spend their time on a single-player campaign with the same aesthetic, mechanical and narrative sensibilities. I've only ever played a few live service games consistently, Warframe until I realised I was spending all of my time grinding to become more efficient and tackle harder difficulties, with no regard for whether that more efficient playstyle was actually fun for me, and Infinity Nikki until I realised that I love Infinity Nikki too much and couldn't interact with it in a healthy way, so I had to go cold turkey. It's difficult to say how long I'll stick with Marathon. I suspect it'll wind up like Helldivers 2, a game I drop into every couple of updates to play for a few weeks, then move on to other things, but I will value the chance to experience what's new when I do so. Unfortunately, it's impossible to say how well Marathon will last. Recent layoffs at Bungie and general management in recent years don't paint a hopeful picture, but at the same time, the team seems dedicated, with a clear path to the changes they intend to make over the coming years, reinforcing central loops while encouraging more casual and beginner-friendly methods of play. I hope it lasts. Even if I know the nature of the structure can never give satisfying answers to its mysteries without also providing new mysteries, it's a fantastic world the team has built that they've only just begun to dip their toes in. There's huge potential for what they could go on to do with it, both by reintroducing elements from the original games or expanding the new elements introduced with this one. It may be the game can't survive managerial issues at Bungie and the hostility from players disappointed by the shutdown of Destiny 2, let alone players who just seem to delight in seeing games fail, driving potential new players away. I hope it does survive. I hope the team get to work on the game for as long as they wish to, neither being shut down before they've achieved everything they want, nor being forced to continue working long after they've lost interest in the project. I know that will be the better timeline, I just hope it's the one we're in. Thanks for watching.